Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ben Pink-Dandelion. I'm part of the Learning and Research team at Woodbrooke, and it's a great pleasure to invite you to the latest Meet the Students. We have this series where we get together with recent graduates from the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies and ask them about, why did they decide to do a PhD? How was it? Any particular practical tips for people thinking about this or already engaged in postgraduate research, and also finding out a little bit more about the original contribution that the researchers made. So with me today is Paul Harris, who graduated last year from the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies, working on the theology of Joseph John Gurney, the 19th century British Quaker. So welcome, Paul. It's very nice to see you again.
It's really, thank you, Ben.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the obvious kind of first question. Why? And you can say it in different ways. Why did you decide to do a PhD?
Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a good question to start at the beginning. I think for me, the subject matter obviously is very important, and for me, that has been an ongoing interest that I've had in Quakerism for a very long time. Alongside that, I think is the fact that I was really keen to get some kind of academic challenge, and I had actually done prior to starting a PhD, I'd actually done a master's in Quakerism as well. So the postgraduate sort of bug had got to me, and I just liked the idea of doing something really in depth and to try and come up with something which was going to have an original contribution as well. So it was a project, it happened to be a retirement project.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, it was really just something which I just saw as being a really attractive sort of proposition to really get my teeth into.
Hmm. Did you ever think about just, perhaps doing it on your own or using, I mean, we offer a research consultancy package as well. We could have just supported you individually. Was there something particular about, becoming part of the university that was attractive?
Obviously, University of Birmingham, is a great university and it's got lots of resources and expertise to help along the way. I just thought by having an academic benchmark, as it were, I'm more accountable in my studies, and so therefore, to meet the particular criteria that you need. I just think is just a useful way for my sort of scholarship to develop really. So I was quite keen to keep to that kind of pathway really of yeah, academic
Yeah.
studies.
So how long a gap was there between, you mentioned doing the MA. I remember you did the MA in Quaker Studies at Lancaster. And
Yes.
then was it a year and a bit, or you had a pause while
Yeah,
you
no,
did
so
that?
I did the MA while I was working
Oh, okay.
full time, but I did the MA actually sort of part time. I think off the top of my head, I think I finished that in 2018, and I began the PhD at the end of September 2020. So a couple of years.
Okay. Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I had in mind, that that was going to be coming at the point that I sort of entered into some form of retirement.
Right. Now you're slightly, I mean, a lot of our students are retired and their projects, are very much following their passions um, and as you say, often fulfilling something they've been wanting to do for some time. But most of the people in that category then decide to study part-time. And you made the interesting choice to go full-time. Would you like to tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I did really think long and hard about this, and I think there's no right or wrong answer. I think it's very much dependent upon the individual concern. My sort of reasoning was that I'm the kind of person I think that tends to sort of put everything into something. So for me, I thought part of this sort of issue might be that if I go part time, in reality, will I just be if effectively working full time,
Yeah.
even though I don't don't need to? So that was one factor that I might as well take advantage of the way I work in the sense of
Mhm.
let's just let's do it. I think there is obviously the benefit of having an intense period of study, which full time presents itself, and I think that can be very helpful. Obviously, in terms of supervision, and you were my main
Hmm.
supervisor, and you were there for the whole period of time, there's perhaps a greater chance that there may be a bit of variation along the
Okay.
way for the longer
Mm.
time period. But I think there are some other um, angles you could take. I mean, for example, with part-time, I could see the fact that maybe a longer period of time gives you a greater opportunity to reflect on things a bit.
Mm. Yeah.
So, perhaps you can sort of sit back a bit and think, yeah, hang on a minute, maybe there's another way of thinking about this. So I think it is pros and cons, but for me, it worked out to be, I think, the best approach. It is intense, but for me personally, I think it was the right thing to do.
Right. So, I mean, the expectation from the University of Birmingham is 35 hours a week. I mean, it's like a
Yes,
full-time
yes,
job,
yes,
and of course, at postgraduate research, we don't kind of work to terms. It's like,
yes,
just
yes,
keep going.
yes, yeah,
So, I mean, and it may be if you're, 20, 2-year-old, that's fine because you've got fewer other responsibilities and,
yes.
but I mean, how easy was it for you to fit, say, 35 hours a week in continuously over 3 years?
It was it was okay, but it's not without its challenges for sure. I mean, without a doubt. Um, in terms of the hours, I would say that um, yeah, I more than covered that number and above it. Obviously, there are ups and downs along the way. So sometimes you get sort of stuck into something, and you really exceed that threshold. I wasn't actually counting the number of hours.
No.
Um, other times, there's a dry patch and you don't really sort of achieve a great deal. But yeah, it is a challenge. I think to have some kind of structure. I mean, obviously there are these. We had our monthly online
Hmm.
meetings to sort of see the progress, and I think that's actually really good because what that did enable me to do is again to be a little bit more accountable in terms of doing. It gave me sort of mini targets to aim for. And I found
Hmm.
that really, really helpful. So it is undoubtedly, if you go full time, a big commitment. You need to be organized and structured in your approach, but it's doable.
Yeah. Were there things you kind of gave up or put to one side and said, well, I can't do this for 3 years because I'm doing the PhD? I mean, and how was it
Well,
with like family members and
my family were very understanding and supportive. Uh, but yeah, there are checks and balances to be made there. I think because it had entered into a different phase in my life of just really beginning to be retired, and also unexpectedly the issue of COVID, which obviously
Mm, mm.
meant that there was actually a more introspective, element to everybody's life at the time. And obviously that wasn't, expected at the time I made the decision to do it, but it nevertheless sort of got married into the way I was sort of operating. I think that the main thing is to sort of give fair warning where perhaps key things are coming up, particular deadlines, so that family members do realize that there are certain things which are going to be harder to sort of move away from in terms
Yeah.
of dates and so on. Other things you can work around. I mean, because it's not in the sense of like a normal that's a place of employment where you're there at a particular time and you leave at a particular time.
Mm.
You have the potential to have that flexibility. So, sometimes the best thinking can be done in the early hours of the morning
Yeah,
or,
sure.
early evening or something like that. So that does give you a greater flexibility, even though the numbers of hours are still there.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in a way, you retired, but didn't retire because you almost went into this other kind of
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
full-time
Yeah.
occupation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I suppose that, the other side of the flexibility is actually you're never totally away from it. There's a kind of a myth about, well, not maybe a myth, but that partners become kind of widows or widowers to the PhD project, and for the time it's going along. But anyway, great. I mean, it obviously sounds like it worked out really well, and it was great you had the support of those around you.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
my family were very supportive, and so I was fortunate in that regard. But there's no doubt about it; it does take you down a different avenue of, life for the period that you're studying. So I was just fortunate in having that support, and I think the flexibility at the time
Hmm.
to do it all.
Yeah. Now, I remember on the MA, you wrote a very fine paper, which actually ended up being published in Quaker Studies around the 1887 Richmond Declaration and the British Quaker response to it. Now, in this project, you were going back a little bit further into history and looking at Joseph John Gurney. What was it about him that was so interesting to you?
Yeah, I mean, Gurney, yeah, just for somebody who, as I said, I've had a very long-standing interest in Quakerism, and I have in the past attended many Quaker meetings, though my tradition is Anglican.
Mhm.
But Gurney actually, for me, is from a personal point of view, seemed to be a very interesting character because a lot of people had written about Gurney in a sort of superficial way, I would say, with one or two very fine exceptions to that, where people did go into greater depth. So he was sort of very well known in the Quaker world, as it were,
Mm.
very influential, extremely influential. And yet, when you started to look at how much work had really been done on his beliefs, it actually was relatively minimal. So one of the things that really drew me to him was the fact that actually here was somebody who really was a very important figure in Quaker history, and yet bizarrely didn't really seem to have had an awful lot of research done on him. I think from a personal point of view, it was also interesting to see what I would call almost like the sort of the edge type questions in theology, which between Quakerism and perhaps the wider Christian church. There are all these sorts of theological areas about the use of theological language, the Quaker testimonies and how they are or not played out in the
Mhm.
wider church. And so it would be interesting, I thought, to see how somebody within the society was at the same time also interacting with people outside the society,
Mhm.
how he was, articulating those views. So I just thought he was um, an attractive sort of person to have a look at in terms of what he was saying,
Mhm.
but I wasn't 100% sure what he was saying, hence the need to actually
Yeah.
really look at it in some depth.
Yes. I mean, one of the things I think your research highlights is the way that so many other scholars have to, build on what's been done before. And so errors even can just get repeated because people are, saying, well, they must have known what they were talking about. And of course, with a PhD project, you're able to say, well, actually, I'm now able to go into this, in all this
Yeah,
lovely time I have and really unpick this. And, I mean, I know that you challenged a number of ideas about Gurney and even the way he's just labeled as a evangelical or,
yeah,
the
yeah,
differences between him and earlier
yeah,
friends and these sorts
yeah,
of things. And you had the time to be able to look at that.
yeah. I mean, I think on a general note, though, I mean, the first thing is that Gurney wrote a lot.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things I really wanted to do was to actually systematically go through all his published works, all his addresses, which, although he didn't authorize them, they go out under the name of Gurney.
Mhm.
And he obviously he had a number of public addresses both here in and in North America. So I wanted to get the sort of the width really of what he'd actually presented to the public in terms of his views. Then, when it comes to the depth of things, it's trying to get to the bottom theologically of what actually he's trying to say. And that's where I think some of the subtleties begin to start
Mhm.
showing up. So rather than perhaps what can sometimes happen without, any disrespect to other researchers, because everybody's coming from a particular perspective, but there can be that sort of rather broad rush approach to say, well, this is what he is, without looking at the finer, material, really, the finer sort of grain analysis, as it were, that it shows that it's not quite as straightforward. So indeed, there are definite bits of Gurney's theology which I would argue do join up quite well with early Quaker beliefs. And when you start looking at terms like evangelical, clearly he had a lot of overlaps. That I wasn't in any way questioning that, but I was questioning that the overlap was 100%.
Hmm.
And that there was a distinctiveness there, and part of that distinctiveness actually included links back to what some of the early friends were saying.
Okay. So less of a difference between Gurney in the 19th century and, say, Robert Barclay in the 17th?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely. So I mean, one of the things that I had to give a lot of thought to actually was, well, I wanted to obviously look at what Gurney was saying, but I wanted to look at it in the context of early Quaker thought alongside the Quaker thought of his day.
Hmm.
But as soon as you sort of look at the question of early Quaker thought, that raises an issue. And this is a generic problem when you go back in time. At what point do you say, with your sort of time machine camera, you take a snapshot, that is, the Quakerism of the 17th century, because it changed, and it is changing. So I came to the conclusion that Berkeley and his main work, Robert Berkeley's main work, The Apology for True Christian Divinity, etc., was the key work in which to sort of act as a benchmark alongside Gurney. So that was helpful. But along the way, of course, you discover that there are other friends out there that Gurney draws upon. He certainly does draw upon Berkeley, and he's quite prepared to criticize Berkeley as well. But he will draw upon friends like Richard Claridge, who in many ways is perhaps fitted in better with Gurney's sort of thinking. Claridge, being a former Anglican who became a friend, was using, I think, some of the language which sort of fitted in a bit more easily with Gurney's understanding. And I think the other thing with any kind of study like this is that context is everything. So, obviously at the time that early friends were around, there were civil wars going on. There was a radical departure from the Anglican Church.
Hmm.
There was a questioning of authority, all sorts of things happening. By the time Gurney was on the scene in the early 19th century, it's a different context. And one of the things that I was trying to argue in my thesis is that the early friends had a vision, I believe, of trying to get back to what sometimes is called primitive Christianity,
Hmm.
if you like, the basic idea of the Christian faith and what it means. And I actually think that Gurney was trying to do the same,
Okay.
um, but in a different context
Hmm.
of the 19th century. But he was trying to argue that position over the course of his lifetime, really.
Okay. Now, I mean, Gurney very nearly becomes an Anglican. He's tutored by Anglicans privately, and he has this amazing moment where he finds him, he's kind of given a sign that he's to keep his hat on when he goes into this high society dinner. And he said, I found myself and was understood to be the decided Quaker. He's kind of enacted the Quaker performance of not removing his hat. I mean, when I talk to you about Gurney, it strikes me that you kind of quite like him. I mean, it is does is his theology similar to where you would find yourself on a kind of Anglican Quaker cusp, or is
Yeah,
it just he's an interesting character?
yeah, no, I think it is absolutely, and I think, I mean, and that's a nice thing, as it were, for me. But there's a danger with that as a
Mhm.
researcher,
Yeah.
because this isn't about what I hope somebody believes for me, as it
Mhm.
were. And I think this sort of basic issue about researcher bias is a problem that everyone has to contend with. I don't think it's ever completely solvable, but it's being
Mhm.
aware of it. That is really important. And I know that there has been a little bit research on some aspects of Quaker studies where it's been flagged up that perhaps if somebody's coming from their own particular Quaker perspective, you can reread the history, as it were, in
Oh
in a
yeah.
different way. But everyone, I'm sure, is trying to do their best to do it as independently as they can. But I do basically align with his views. I mean, I didn't know by any means all his views, before I started the research. So,
Mhm.
and I'm not saying there's a complete overlap, but to my mind, yeah, for me personally, there is. He was um, very prepared to talk to people outside of the Society of Friends. There was a definite openness there, but at the same time, there is a caution of not overstepping the theological boundary where he feels that the line is there. And I think internally, obviously, what he was trying to do in his mind was to sort of re-establish what he thought were the sort of basic bits of the framework that early friends were
Mhm.
operating in, which he felt needed, as it were, a readjustment. Now, obviously, that was his view, and other Quakers would today or in his time or earlier would say, well, no, that he's misunderstood it completely. But my view is that actually his thinking was much more sophisticated and nuanced. And so it wasn't trying to be a Trojan horse to get Anglicanism within the
Mhm.
Society of Friends, but it was a sort of fine tuning of what he believed the early Friends, actually believed.
Yes.
I think he actually intuitively, although I believe they would have been very different characters, but intuitively he was very aligned to Fox.
Okay.
And occasionally you see that just in as a little note that, basically I'm with George Fox. And so I think of all the friends, he
Mhm.
actually intuitively, he saw in Fox something which did relate to himself. He's certainly not against Berkeley at all, who actually is, I can't remember how many generations goes back, but he was a grandson of Berkeley
Okay. All
on
right.
his mother's side, great
Mm-hmm.
great great grandson. So he's certainly in no way is he against Berkeley, but he is prepared to challenge at least some of the interpretations of Berkeley's work.
Okay. Okay. Good. So there could be an advantage. I mean, I think you're right in saying that, no researcher has a neutral relationship to the topic they're looking at. I mean, I think we've talked a lot in this series about how you have to be passionate about your subject just to
Yeah,
keep going
yeah,
through the long nights and the lying awake in the early hours and that kind of thing. But and it's either going to be a positive relationship or some kind of at least passionate relationship. Um, but I suppose it could be said, there's an advantage for you ostensibly as a non-Quaker coming to look at this Quaker theologian, and it really doesn't matter where you end up because it's not going to affect kind of how you think about your faith now. So, I think probably
yeah,
about a third of our students are not Quakers, and I always think that brings a freshness.
yeah, 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 definitely. No, I absolutely agree. And yeah, you're right. The pressure is off in the sense that you know I haven't sort of set my stall out in terms of that. Um, but there is a genuine interest. I mean, I think obviously when you're doing something like a PhD, you have got to have that initial interest. Now, I know it's quite reasonable. It's all part of human nature that that interest may wither a little bit on the vine at some point because of all the pressures involved in the doctorate. But actually, one of the few things that I can sort of say with absolute certainty, really, is that my interest actually never really waned at all.
Okay.
I had all
Well,
sorts of issues in terms of, just writing stuff and, and just thinking out how can I articulate this and so on, and the various deadlines that come along the way. But the actual material I just found really interesting. And because it involves so many big theological ideas which are still relevant today and are still being
mhm.
discussed today. What was being discussed in Gurney's day, and indeed in the days of Fox, in terms of like, how much is expected of people knowing about the Bible. And if they don't
Mhm.
know anything about the Bible, what does that mean theologically? Well, that's a question that's been asked in every century,
Yeah.
and it's still being asked within, Christian circles. And Gurney had his views, Berkeley had his, and so on, and they actually were pretty close. But those are big questions that can certainly
Hmm.
occupy your mind in the small hours of the
Yeah.
morning.
So you never got fed up with him. You didn't.
No, I didn't actually. No,
Wonderful.
I can
Yeah.
actually say that is true. Yeah, the actual subject matter was, just really was of interest to me. And I think, when you're doing something like a PhD, obviously you are focusing in on something, which is very specific. I think that family and friends, those that I talked to, were very understanding, but you do sometimes begin to realize that what may inspire and motivate you, bizarrely, is not on everybody's,
Sure.
agenda. So that actually can take a while to get used to that because
Hmm.
you are really so involved in this. This becomes your world, and then suddenly you're stepping outside of that world, and
Hmm.
why would anyone else be sort of thinking along those lines? So I think that can be a bit of a challenge actually
Hmm.
for folk when they're doing it.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely vital, I would say, that you do, if somebody's thinking about doing a PhD, that they do think about something that they think is going to keep their motivation going, because there are difficulties, or I should say perhaps challenges, in terms of, well, it will vary according to the person, but there will be ups and downs along the way. And I think in reality, if you don't have that core interest, it
Hmm.
becomes really difficult. But if the interest is going to be the thing that keeps you motivated, then I think you can, get through the deadlines and things that.
Yeah. No, good. Excellent. But now this was I mean, a very theological PhD. Well, there's two questions. I suppose the first is you end up describing him as a New Testament Quaker.
Yes.
Could you say a bit
Yeah.
more about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that sort of phrase, New Testament Quaker, which obviously is opened up to a lot of potential interpretations. One of the things that Gurney did, both sort of, he had the occasional habit of producing a work which was printed and circulated to a few people, but
Okay.
not to everyone. Okay, so what he would call privately circulated. So in one or two of those privately, well, at least in one um, of those private circulated things, he talks about Quakerism being the religion of the New Testament. He then actually uses that phrase in more public um, materials as well. And actually, you can see it appearing on and off throughout his um, lifetime, really. Particularly at the end when he produces a book which is sort of virulently really against sort of church-based hierarchies, and which has primarily been ignored in academic research.
Mm.
Um, and so this idea really of New Testament Quakerism is trying to convey this concept that he also was attempting to show that Quakerism is a way of trying to get back to the original church as he perceives it, or the original Christian church, stripping away the structures which he would view as being superfluous. So
Hmm.
you're maintaining that immediate connection between the person and God, taking away some of the church structures, as it were, bringing up the Quaker testimonies as sort of fruits of the Spirit. And so really, trying to show what a living church is really about. And so, yeah, the New Testament idea is just really trying to get that across. Now, of course, people can argue that other Quakers would also say the same,
Hmm.
and I accept that. But what I suppose I was trying to articulate there was that I think that that is a better description of him, or an attempt to describe him, rather than to say he was an evangelical Quaker.
Okay.
Because actually that's a very broad term
Hmm.
that encompasses a lot of ideas, many of which Gurney would be okay with. There would be some where he would be, you know, set apart from. And so therefore, I think New Testament gives a better understanding what he was really trying to achieve.
Excellent. Thank you. So here we are. You're deep in Gurney's theology. I mean, people would assume that you had done a theology degree, but actually your background is in biology. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. So how difficult was that? I mean, just you both not just learning about how to do a PhD, how to do research,
Yeah.
but also suddenly into this whole new discipline in a sense.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and it was a challenge. I think that there are two things. One is I realized along the way that from a specifically sort of Quaker point of view, I actually had got quite a lot of material that I'd collected over the years. I mean,
Okay.
I don't the amount I have is not, a vast collection in any way. They're all things you can easily, buy. But I sort of began to realize that actually I had, without, I don't think exaggeration, sort of saturated myself in quite a lot of Quaker theology for a long period of time. And I think that did help. And definitely doing the masters,
Mhm.
had helped with giving me that foundation. However, that is quite the same as looking at things to do with broader theological issues. So, for example, if you take something like the Trinity, it's one thing to just give a very simple definition of the Trinity. It's another thing to start unpicking, what we mean by elements of that definition and so on. And that did require a lot of additional background reading um, to make sure that I'm confident that what I'm talking about sort of marries in well. I think one of the things I learned there was the incredible importance. It's an obvious point I'm about to make, but the incredible importance of being very precise and clear with your language, and not to make assumptions without checking that actually that is what's meant. At the same time, what you also begin to realize is that for some theological ideas, these are organic concepts which are still changing. They're not fixed in stone. They may be fixed in stone in terms of a particular church's confessional statement, let's say,
Mhm.
but in the broader world of theology, they're still very much open to debate. So again, it was trying to get that width in one's understanding. So, I would try and look at, both different elements of the Protestant faith, whether that be more traditional, if you like, or perhaps more nonconformist, but also look at Roman Catholicism, for example, to see how the Catholic faith, which Berkeley, had training in himself, would compare to the theology of early friends, or what Gurney was saying. So, but it was an enjoyable challenge, but it was a challenge.
Yeah.
One of the things actually, that comes to mind when you say that, there was a useful periodical that I came across called the Christian Observer, which was a monthly publication produced by some members of the Church of England back in the 19th century, primarily, I think, in evangelical, sort of mildly evangelical sort of Church of England ministers. And that actually was really interesting because Gurney actually wrote several letters and small articles for that journal, and they also did reviews. So, and when I
Mhm.
say reviews, these these people really did review in depth, and so that was actually really helpful because you had people from a different tradition who were definitely friendly towards Gurney, saw him as an ally, but prepared to be a critical friend in trying to analyze some of his theology. So, and that was a rich source of material for me in terms of, learning some of that sort of theology from a different perspective other than the Quaker approach.
But a little bit nerve-wracking then when you needed to, or potentially hand in work to your supervisory team, which included,
Yes.
academic
Yeah.
theologians and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But there again, because as I mentioned, you were my main supervisor, but I did have two other supervisors as well, who were also very helpful in giving that perspective. One, John Kirshner from a Quaker perspective, the other Wolfgang von D from the more Orthodox Christian perspective. So it was helpful to iron out some of those sort of Christological sort of issues. Yeah.
But I mean, actually, there was no, it wasn't it that anybody came back and said, "Oh, you've totally misunderstand, this or that." I mean, it was, you did a really good job at
Thank
getting
you. Thank
into
you.
the theology of the period. So,
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned COVID, and you mentioned starting your degree in 2020. Here you are going to look at historical theology of the 19th century, and suddenly all the libraries are shut and all the archives are shut. So,
Yeah.
how did you manage that, Paul?
Okay, well, I was just incredibly fortunate, and so I cannot claim any credit for this whatsoever. But I had a few months before the official start of the PhD, and so I was able to amass some material beforehand, including at the time. Some digitized material from the British Library, which was available on their website. This was prior to, sadly, to the cyber attack, which they had
Mhm.
much later on. So, as it happens, I was able to sort of, squirrel few things away before, COVID really sort of prevented me from needing to go to the library. So, in fact, for a very long time, I was able to do everything based on the material that I'd already gathered without the need to visit a library. I did. And I think that was just very unusual, and I was just very fortunate. I did obviously visit libraries as time went on, primarily though to pick up on material that was not easily available through digitized sources. So, Library Society of Friends in London, I went to a lot. The British Library, I went to a
Mhm.
lot. But I also did visit some others, Lambeth Palace Library on one occasion, and also one or two other libraries were very helpful in providing me with material. One actually through a virtual meeting that allowed me to
Wow.
look at a book. Another by sending material, over the internet, just emailed, by taking photos of the material. So it was very helpful.
Mm.
So I think I was fortunate, but it flags up, I think, a really important issue actually, which is if you are going to rely upon particular institutions as sources of information, here comes a really obvious point, but the penny dropped with me, almost at the end of the PhD. It's worth checking out not just, the times that they open and close each week, but also are there coming up special closure dates? Now, obviously, we are fortunately in a post-COVID world now, but obviously, libraries do need to do things outside of that kind of scenario. And it's actually definitely worth one's while keeping an eye on the library website to make sure that they're not suddenly going to be closed for a
Mm.
month or two, which actually really could, put you off of target. Or if you see that coming, you can begin to prioritize a bit and think, right, yeah, I need this material. I will go now and get this, because otherwise I'm not going to get it.
Yeah, I mean, often there's very little notice, and also in my experience, archives and libraries are often a little optimistic about when they're going to reopen
Yes,
again,
yes,
always
yeah, yeah,
hoping for the
yeah,
best.
yeah,
But yes,
yeah,
so that kind
yeah,
of planning's
yeah,
important. Now, you
yeah.
did also make another decision, though, which was just to use published works of Gurney.
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean that was quite a big decision. I mean, in fact, it may sound straightforward to say published works, but even that is open to some discussion, which you and I had on a few occasions. I mean, first of all, in terms of the published works, which, if you take in the general spirit of the word, i.e., books that were freely available or material that was freely available at the time of that he was alive. Um, that itself is a considerable corpus of material. And in fact, I spent quite a lot of time creating an appendix
Mm.
of summarizing his works to just help the sort of the reader, as it were. And it is quite staggering how much he wrote. So there's a lot of material there. Then there is a bit more of a grey area, which I made some decisions on as part of my sort of definition of what I call published work. Where, I mean, one grey area is the fact that, as I mentioned before, there were many public addresses that Gurney gave, which were basically taken down shorthand or whatever and published. And some of the editor comments at the beginning of these books are quite amusing, where they really sort of, say what a wonderful chap he is, etc. And then right at the end, but we do apologise, but we haven't actually had his permission. But but we know the public want this, so the public must have it. So now those books, those addresses have often been quoted by people. They appear under the name J.J. Gurney,
Mm.
but actually, they don't have his stamp of approval. But I included those,
Mhm.
but I was more cautious with them
Okay.
because there is the potential there and for error. Interestingly enough, after Gurney's death, Joseph Bevan Braithwaite, who became a very senior evangelical friend within the society, he was asked by the Gurney family to write memoirs about Gurney, which he duly did, and those are in the public domain. Now, obviously, he would have chosen what went in and what perhaps didn't go in,
Mm.
but these
Mhm.
are substantial works, incredibly useful if you're researching on Gurney. But he also made the point sometimes that the addresses were not particularly accurate always,
Mm.
but actually did sometimes quote from those addresses because the basic point that was being made by Gurney was still there, very evident.
Okay.
So that was one example. And then there were these other ones which I mentioned where some of the material were publicly available in the sense that Gurney had been giving them out to people, but they were on a restricted circulation. And so, they've become available today, as it were, but they would have had a restricted circulation. And I included not what most in terms of the relevance to my research there, not all of them for various reasons. And I just felt that that itself was a huge volume of material. And the other factor was that I really wanted to know what Gurney was saying to the public, as it were, however you may define that, rather than on this occasion, his internal thinking, which he might be saying more to himself. I did look at some of his personal journals. So behind the scenes, I'd like to think, a much greater width in my knowledge of Gurney rather than just his books.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I saw, volumes upon volume of personal journals that he had got over the years. And I didn't read all of them, but I looked at bits to get an idea and other things as well to build up a picture of the person himself. Um, but it was really how these ideas were being presented
Mhm.
to, his contemporaries, uh, both within and outside the society.
Right. So,
I'll just say one thing very actually, it came into my mind today in thinking about this thing. That there was a classic example of where a rule is, I think you alluded to it, of, checking, that what's being written is just check that it is actually true. Because one of these things which Gurney produced, which was more on restricted circulation, which was perceived as being critical to the early Friends' interpretation of certain scriptural passages, um, for reasons which have never been made public. Somehow, one of those copies got to somebody over in the United States. This is back in the 1800s, and they republished that work, which is freely available, and you can get it on different websites. It's there. But I looked through it, and it's meant to be a word for word copy
uh-huh.
of what Gurney wrote. But actually, at one point, I'm sure it was just a mistake, but there is a mistake, and it completely changes the meaning of the
Wow.
sentence. So if you were just using that as your source,
Mm.
you'd actually come to a very different conclusion.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, so if we can go back to the kind of process of the research, and I might ask you some, if you've got any tips in a minute for other researchers. But I mean, I know you set yourself a very challenging deadline to complete this. You wanted to get it done, preferably, on the day, and you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
um, but I mean, there you are. So, particularly towards the end, there was great momentum. You were probably doing way more than 35 hours a week. You were kind of beavering away. New drafts were coming, and then suddenly it's done, and you hand it in, and there's this kind of maybe 2 month pause before the Viva, and then the Viva, which went very well, and you had a few, just a few little things to change, and then it's all gone. So first of all, how was the gap between handing it in and the Viva? And then how has it been since? Because one minute you're at the cutting edge and you are now I think probably the expert scholar on Gurney's theology. And yet, the thesis is online, but on a shelf in a sense. And so how have been these moments of kind of pause or stop or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting question. And in fact, if I may, I'll go back one step. I think
Yeah.
another
Hmm.
um, time that's significant is when I handed in, as it were, a draft to all my supervisors, basically a year before, no, not quite a year, but
Mm-hmm.
almost a year
Hmm.
between that and the actual handing in of the thesis. And at the time, I remember there, so that would have been for me back in August 2023, feeling a great sense of relief that I'd sort of got a draft thesis, even though it was well over the word count, which I knew at the time, and I
Hmm.
would be sort of taking measures to cut that back. Um, but then through to ultimately submitting it in the following April. To answer your question specifically on that point, you had very kindly pre-warned us on various meetings that if once you've handed it in or submitted it
Yeah.
electronically to be precise, then don't reread it until nearer the time of the Viva. Which basically, I think, bar the first day or two when I did go look at it, I actually then did switch off, and that
Okay,
was
good.
okay until I then obviously had to prepare for the Viva, and that was okay. And then dealing with the minor corrections, that was sorted. There was definitely a gulf afterwards. I
Mm.
can't deny that. It was a very strange feeling because it had taken over one's life for the
Yeah.
last 3 or 4 years, and now suddenly it was very quiet. And although in principle one could immediately start writing papers and things like that, I just, for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure what it was, I just didn't really have the desire or maybe the energy or
Mm-hmm.
the enthusiasm to do that. Although I have begun to do that now.
Oh, good.
So interestingly, there was a bit of a sort of delay there of a year or so, but so it's taken a while to find my feet and to get
Mm.
involved in other things in life. But I'm still interested in trying to communicate, as it were, through different means, some of the ideas that I've picked up. So yes, I think it's something definitely to prepare for
Yeah.
psychologically. It's quite a sudden
Mm-hmm.
cut,
Mm.
in terms of what you've been doing and you've got to re-establish yourself in the world really and have normal conversations with people that
Yes.
don't somehow get converted into linking everything to,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that after that
yeah,
gap, you
yeah,
are now
yeah,
keen to
yeah,
disseminate the findings because I think, they're very
yeah,
significant.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And
yeah.
for those of us who've written broad brush kind of books about the 19th century, we're going to have to write them in a different way because of your research. So that's a, real contribution.
Okay.
Um, so we're coming towards the end of the time. I wonder if you had any particular, you've offered a number of useful tips and insights for for people either doing research or contemplating. But are there any other things you'd like to pass on to
Yeah,
students?
and forgive me if I sort of occasionally look to the side because I jotted one or two things
Oh,
down
great, good.
because I thought if you did ask this, I mean, I've divided them into two sort of types really. One like just basic practical, which has got nothing to do with the actual subject matter you're
Mhm.
looking at. The other one is the academic. The practical things, I mean, some of these things are ridiculously simple, and I'm sure anyone looking at this video might think, oh, really, is that what this person is saying? I think where I'm coming from is it actually depends a little bit on how you just work in the way you approach your work, and also your ability when it comes to word processing. Now, as a self-assessment of myself, I would say I'm a reasonable word processor. I certainly wouldn't claim to great expertise, but I'm not a beginner. And in my working life, I was using, word processing all the time. But when it comes to things like towards the end of your PhD, the likelihood is that you'll have several chapters,
Mhm.
and then there'll come a point where you will merge those chapters into one document. Now, if you're not familiar with how to do that, um, if you're not familiar about, it may seem really trivial, but page numbering and the vagaries of the system of trying to number pages and section breaks and things like that. So one thing I'm flagging up is that it's a good idea to anticipate if you're not sure about some of these basic things, whether whatever type of software you might be using. I appreciate it may be Microsoft or it may be a different type of software, but whatever you're using for word processing, to think about some of the operations that may be needed. I actually, and I know this sounds a little bit sad, but I actually discovered halfway through my studies the preparation that you needed for the thesis in terms of like page margins and so on, the actual dimensions. So I started using those. I decided on the font. So I think if you could do that at the beginning, check what the thesis requirements are. It just saves you time. If you're using the font that is compatible and is
Mhm.
arranged. I mean, these are really simple things, but I think they are
Mhm.
important. Um, most of my note taking that I was doing from books that I had access to at home were then I just typed them up. But and I don't quite know why I did this, but for me, when I went into libraries, I didn't ever do any typing. I used a pencil
Mhm.
and a book. And that worked for me. But if you go down that route, I would strongly encourage people to take photographs of their notes so that if the worst happens and they lose the book, they have
Yeah.
a backup. Because obviously, everybody wants backups of the electronic copies, which I was doing, and
Mhm.
that's really, emphasized a lot in training from the university as well. But at the same time, handwritten notes can get forgotten a bit. And it suddenly dawned on me one day that, I'm going to be in trouble if I lose these. So I just took photos of my own handwriting. But that was just really helpful to
Yeah.
know that I actually had a backup. And then actually, because there were quite a lot of pages, I can't remember now, 100 and more, and because there may be several different books being mentioned there,
Mhm.
um, then the problem became I noticed that when I wanted to find something, I was struggling. So then I set up a little, very simple document which just I numbered each page in my book and then put the title in the document
Mhm.
so that I could then just use a search find thing. So I could instantly find, oh, it's on page 62 or something
Okay.
without wasting time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It made quite a difference there. So those were
Uh,
some of the
yeah.
practical things. Yeah, and I've also mentioned, oh yes, another one actually is obviously giving careful thought to the choice of referencing system that you're going to use, and whether you're going to do your own referencing or use software. But leaving aside, all of that in terms of that decision making, one of the things that I realized was that uh, often people will, once they've quoted a work with its full title, they will use an abbreviated um, title for the follow-up
Yes.
references to that. Uh, the software that I was using, which was excellent software, but I hadn't appreciated that without me making it clear to the software which edition I was using, when those shortened titles came out, it wouldn't reference the edition. Now, I was able to deal with that, but the penny dropped
Yeah.
towards
Yeah.
the end. So, it's those little things actually that are
Yes.
worth thinking about. Academically,
Hmm.
um, I think it's very important to check up on copyright in terms of the materials that one is using. I was fortunate because of basically the era that I was,
Hmm.
focusing on. But nevertheless, you've obviously got modern day
Hmm.
sources as well. But for other folk, that could be important. I think the methodology is really important to think through how you're going to approach whatever you're going to do and why are you doing it that
Hmm.
way. And kind of linked to that in terms of the outcome you know, is this going to bring some kind of original outcome to at least some degree? So rather than, it's a purely descriptive process without perhaps that element of, and this is what it's led to.
Yes.
So I think academically methodology is important, and we've touched upon it several times today. But yeah, don't assume that what has been written is necessarily,
Mm.
some of it is subjective, and it's not necessarily cast in stone.
Absolutely.
And also, I've said here, uh, yeah, try and be very careful with one's language,
Hmm.
be clear about what you mean, so that I did spend a bit of time in my thesis defining what I
Hmm.
meant by early Quakerism.
Yes. Key terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that even if it was, people might say, well, I disagree with that, but at least they knew the parameters in which you were
Yeah.
working under.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I think one of the, really what happens through the PhD process is, as I say, you become the expert in your area. You in a sense, joining the ranks of other scholars. You're learning what it is to do research. And as you say, just because something's been published, it doesn't mean it's right. And, academia builds upon this set of, layers of claims, superseding and building on and, improving and so thank you very much for those insights. And thank you for your work because, as I say, it really has, I'm sure, made a big difference to the way we think about Gurney and the way we then think about British Quakerism in the 19th century, and of course, Gurney's huge influence in North America and the separations that happened there, partly as a result of his preaching and ministry. Your thesis is online. People can Google Paul Harris e-theses and they can then.
I think it may not be yet, Ben.
Oh, well, I think very shortly.
But
Okay,
very
well,
shortly, yes.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
do look
yeah.
out for it.
Yes, yeah.
And then we'll look forward to the publications that you're working
Thank
on
you.
currently. So
Thank you.
thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a
You're very
pleasure again, as
welcome.
always, to talk
Yeah,
with you. And we'll be back with the next in this series on April the 14th, when I'll have Oscar Malandi with me, who has been researching Kenyan Quakerism.